Welcome to CNRL Author Talks, where authors come to talk about their latest books with librarians from the Central Northern Regional Library in New South Wales, Australia. This week, we revisit an author talk from the archive. In February of 2009, Australian filmmaker Stephen M. Irwin visited Tamworth City Library to discuss his debut novel, The Dead Path.
Thank you very much for coming out on such a lovely day when it would be more pleasant to be outside in the sun having a cup of tea. I'm very lucky to be part of the Big Book Club tour and to be able to come here to Tamworth, which is a town that I don't get to anywhere near often as I'd like to. It's really pleasant to see people who are interested in reading, like me. So it's great. Because not all events are like this in front of civilised, intelligent, nice-smelling people like yourselves. Before I started the tour up in Brisbane, I was at a book signing, which wasn't as nice an affair as this. It was one of those things in a shopping mall where I was put on a little card table with just a little barricade of my own books to separate me from all the rushing, unhappy-looking people. I've never actually been in the stocks, but I think I know what it would be like now. It would be like being at a book signing in a mall, with the only difference being that in the stocks you don't want people to come up to you, but at a book signing you do, in the hope that they'll have a chat and maybe buy your book. And for my sins, someone did come up and she picked a book up off the barricade, and she didn't say anything. She had a look at the back cover blurb, and I could see what she was reading. Nicholas Close, Haunted Man, Sees Dead People, or Wife Dies, Back in Australia, Terrifying Woods, Strange Talisman, Missing Children, Murdered Children, Evil in the Woods. Is it real or made up? I said, well, it's fiction. She put it down and left without a word, as if it was the most vile kind of pornography known to man, which maybe some people think it is. And I had plenty of time to think about her reaction in between all the people not coming up and talking to me. And I realised that her response was probably a valid one, a little impolite, but quite fair and reasonable, because she wanted a non-fiction book. She wanted the truth. She wanted the whole book to be a true story. And when I pick up a book, and maybe when you pick up a book too, you need a certain amount of truth, whether it seems like the setting is real, or the characters speak like real people, or they act like real people, or just the description is so beautifully rendered that it feels like you're in a real place, even if it's somewhere that doesn't exist in real life. That element of truth is essential in order to achieve escape velocity, to sign on for the ride and go to that special place that only books can take us to. Just that certain amount of truth. For each of us it's a different amount, but I think that there has to be a kernel of truth in every book. And it was escape that got me reading books in the first place, a million years ago when I was a little boy, because I come from a big family with 5 sisters and no brothers. So I learnt very early on in life the meaning of the word terror, which is being cornered by 3 women with makeup saying, let's give him a makeover. So I learned 2 important skills when I was a child. One was hiding, which doesn't do much good on days like today. And the other was how to entertain myself. And there's nothing better for self-entertainment when you're on the lam than to have a good book. And I was very lucky because I went to a school which had a good library, and bless the librarians, they are second only to the angels. It also had a book club, which some of you might remember from school. It was one of those pamphlets that would go around the class with a list of books, and you tick the one that you want and you pay your $2.95 or whatever it was way back when, and you wait a couple of weeks and then the book turns up and it's like Christmas, except at school. And often as not, the books that I would buy would be ghost stories, which was strange because I was a very fearful child with a catalogue of terrors that extended well beyond makeovers and included spiders and railway crossings, both of which have found their way into this book, and possums and magpies and the deep end of the pool and public urinals and cat weasel and a whole lot of other things that I was scared of. But ghost stories didn't scare me. I love them. Or maybe they did scare me, but I love being scared. And it's a love affair that's lasted all my life. And I remember that the first books that I used to enjoy reading, the ghost stories, were The Three Investigators by Robert Arthur. This gentleman remembers them, or he looks like he does. And what boy wouldn't? I mean, riding around in a Rolls Royce with your mates, solving the mystery of the Whispering Mummy or the Haunted Castle or whatever. But we get older and we grow up and our tastes change, and I started enjoying books like Something Wicked This Way Comes and The Day of the Triffids. Books that were more weighty, that had more of that truth that I was talking about, because sometimes the characters were flawed or the endings weren't necessarily happy. And I remember the book, of all the hundreds of books that I read at school, that was the hinge book that closed the door on The Three Investigators and opened it on The Midwich Cuckoos and other wonderful books. And it was a book by a British author called Susanna Cooper, who lives in the United States now, I think. And the book in question was called The Dark is Rising, which is a series of books by the same name. And I don't know why that book stuck in my head, but it did. And it was when I was doing the polished draft of the manuscript for The Dead Path, and I was trying to draw out some more of the themes that I'd put into the book, themes of wood and water and fire and blood. And I realised what a debt of gratitude that I owed The Dark is Rising, because Susan Cooper had done three important things that I realised I'd tried to do with this book as well. The first was to do with those themes. She had done something very special, which Tolkien taught me again later on, that something doesn't have to be big to be powerful. It doesn't have to be a transformer robot, 40 feet high to have potency. Something very small like a golden ring, or in the case of her book, these little elemental signs can have great potency if they're written properly. And while she used these 6 signs, I used a little talisman, which I'll read a little bit about later on. Another thing which she taught me, which was very important, was that mythology can be brought from the past into the present and feel real. In the case of The Dark is Rising, it was Arthurian mythology that she had brought into the then present of that book, 1974 or something. And I brought the legend of the Green Man into the present of this book, which is 2007, and I'll talk a bit more about the Green Man later on. And the third and probably most important thing that The Dark is Rising told me is what so many great stories are, which is simply about a seemingly ordinary person thrust into extraordinary circumstances, which is the basis of so many great stories. Which is something that I should have learned again when I was at art college studying film and television, but I was far too busy worrying about zits and what Meredith Henderson actually meant when she said, "Oh, hi." But I graduated somehow. I managed to pass, and I had no idea what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to write films or direct films or light films or be the cameraman. Fortunately, I was no good at any of them, so I started a long cavalcade of odd jobs, including handyman and drinks waiter and roadie for rock and roll shows and lecturer in stills photography and a dozen other jobs as well, which at the time made me feel like a bit of a nong. But in retrospect, I'm really grateful for as a writer, because I was meeting real people, interesting people, doing interesting jobs. And I think as a writer you need to have your roots in some real soil, because if you just sit in front of a computer, it runs the risk of your work becoming self-referential, or at worst, referring to other people's writing instead of referring to real life. And you run the risk of losing that bit of truth that I was talking about. How people really walk and talk and look. So I'm very grateful for that. But despite the odd jobs, I did get back to writing in the end. I think when you love something enough, you come back to it. And I started writing corporate videos, promotional and training videos, literally hundreds of them for producers around Brisbane. Videos on how to make a road, how to make toughened glass, how to make galvanised pipe, how the Brisbane airport baggage handling system works. Sounds dull, was dull, but also really important, because even though the subject matter wasn't terribly interesting to me, it had to be made interesting for the viewer. So you had to have an interesting hook at the start to get people watching, then a middle which had succinct information packaged in a way that would engage with the audience, and a satisfying conclusion. All the basics of storytelling, which again, something I should have learned if I wasn't, too busy at art college wondering whether stonewashed denim was in or out. But better late than never. So learning story structure was so important and was very useful with making real documentaries for TV, which was great fun but hard work, and making drama, short films and so forth, which have been delightful and good fun. But filmmaking is a very collaborative business, as most of you probably have some sense. There's not many films that are made by one person. You usually have a crew of 30 or 50 or 100 people all working together to create something. And as the writer, you're like the architect of a building. You should know what the building looks like in your mind when you start, but then you've got to reduce all that down to lines on a page and leave it to other people to put up the girders and the facade and to furnish the offices. And it's the same with film scripts. You should know what the world is like, every detail of it, how the people walk and talk and look and what the quality of the light is. But then you have to reduce all that down to a very Spartan, strictly regimented page, which is very terse action description and dialogue in the present tense. So a very constrained layout. And I think I reached a point when I got a little bit bored with that and wanted to do some writing which didn't require schmoozing producers and doing storyboards and scene breakdowns and budgets and auditions. Just writing. And short stories were the way to go. And it was a wonderful step into a strange new country where I could use different tenses and long sentences, and if I was daring, more than one adjective. And most importantly, the occasional verb, you can't overdo them. But most importantly, you could, in short stories and in long fiction as well, you can write what people think, which you can't do with film scripts. You can only show what they say and do. You can't write what's going on in their mind. So it was wonderful to be able to do that. It was like getting the bends, but in a good way. All this freedom to suddenly do what I wanted. And it was delightful when some of those short stories won some competitions. Because when you get that little bit of recognition, it lets you dream. Maybe if I can write short stories that aren't too bad, maybe I could write a long story that's not too bad. And the other thing, of course, which is inspiring, or which inspires me, is other people's novels. Not the good ones, not the Wars and the Steinbecks and the Mantells and the Hartnetts, but the really bad ones that you pick up and in a couple of pages you read it and you go, how on earth did this get published? This is rubbish. I could write this. I could write better than this. My dog could write better than this. And you sort of think, well, that's kind of nice. I might actually give that a go one day. I might write a novel. But then opportunity knocks, and that's very scary. At the end of 2006, my wife took a look at our finances, and I just finished a fairly lucrative corporate job. And she said, you don't have to work again for another 3 months. So I thought, great, if you need me, I'll be in front of the TV watching Ellen. But she had something else in mind. She said, no, you could write something long form, you could write a book. Which is very scary, because before you start something, your potential is unlimited. It's untested, but unlimited. But then when an opportunity like this happens, then you get to quantify on paper the exact distance between that unlimited potential and your actual ability, and that's a very scary thing to do. Because it's only a binary outcome. It either works or it doesn't. But my wife, her belief was inspiring and infectious, and I gave it a go. But the blank page is also a scary thing, and I don't know how many of you here are writers, but there are a million universes of a million possibilities with books. And I've learned, for me at least, writing is making decisions. You just have to make choices. You don't know whether they're the right one or the wrong one at the time often, but if you don't make a choice, nothing happens at all. So you have to make some choices and get going and keep writing. So I made 2 important choices at the start, 2 rails for the story to run along, for the dead path. The first was that it would be set in Brisbane, because that's where I'm from. I grew up there and I know it pretty well. And I figured, well, if I set it there, at least for the reader, it's going to seem like the setting is real. So there'll be that much truth in it. And that'll get me that little bit ahead of the game. So Brisbane. And the other thing was that I decided it would be a ghost story. Because, as you know, I like ghost stories. And I think one of the important dictums of writing should be write what you like. Because, let's face it, you might be the only one who reads it in the end. So you might as well write to an assured audience. So ghost story set in Brisbane. But that means more decisions, because apparently people have written ghost stories before, some quite, not bad writers like Shakespeare and Dickens and God in the Bible have all written about ghosts. So need to write ghosts that, at least I thought, for the reader would seem a little bit fresh and different. And I think in New South Wales you have this too. I think probably all around the country, those very sad sights of little crosses on the side of the road, or these bouquets of flowers that people have tied to telegraph poles where someone has come to grief. And being of a macabre kind of bent, sometimes when I'm passing those, I wonder, well, is there anything left there of that person? Right there in that spot where the cross is, that I'm not seeing. And I thought, well, that's not a bad way for me to approach the ghosts in this. And so Nicholas Close, the protagonist of this novel, ends up with this horrible ability to see people in the moments of their death. But they're in the last moments that happen over and over and over again, trapped in this loop that just continues. And for him, it drives him almost mad. And it would me too. And I thought, well, that's a very disturbing image. And it doesn't necessarily, speak about whether that person was good or evil. It doesn't say whether that's real or whether it's just kind of a vision. So I leave that for the reader to make up their mind. But that had another problem, because then that wasn't the centre of the story. You have to decide whether the ghost is going to be the guts of the story and the antagonist, or whether it would just be a peripheral thing. And I decided it would be peripheral. So I still needed the meat, what the story was going to be about. So I started the wonderful part of writing for me, which is research, which to the untrained eye looks a lot like just sitting in front of a computer looking at pictures, because it really is just sitting in front of a computer looking at pictures. But I did find a great picture which stuck in my head, which was from a 13th century cathedral in Bamberg in Germany. And this medieval cathedral has a corbel in it, and several other stone carvings. So it's a sandstone shelf bracket, basically, that's carved in the face of the Green Man. And I don't know if any of you know the Green Man, and even if you haven't, you'd probably recognise him if you saw him. It's a human face made of leaves, oak leaves or acanthus leaves, or emerging from foliage, or with leaves coming out of the corner of his mouth as tusks, or out of his nose or ears, or all of those things. It's a very old image that predates Christianity and is found throughout Europe and Asia, and has been appropriated by, it was appropriated by many medieval Christian churches, because he signifies the death of things in winter and their rebirth in spring, the seasonal life and death of things, which you can see correlates nicely with the Christian ethic of resurrection. And so the Green Man is found in many cathedrals, but this particular one in Bamberg stuck in my head and wouldn't let me go. And that's when I knew, well, I've got the last thematic element of this book. And he brought something extra to the book that I didn't know I was going to have, which was some magic. And a particular kind of woods magic, this earthy magic, which was delightful for me, but also scary, because apparently people have written about magic too. J.K. Rowling has done a lot for readers. She's brought a whole generation of people to reading books. But her magic is very specific and kind of esoteric, and it's got its own language. For those of you who've read the Harry Potter books, you know that they're kind of a wordplay Latin magic that she uses. I didn't want to have to create a whole system of magic that people needed to concentrate on and understand and learn. So I imbued a little rune with my magical potency, and I'll read a bit about that rune shortly. So it was great. I had everything. I had the setting, Brisbane. I had ghosts. I had magic. All I needed was the start. What's called in screenwriting parlance the inciting incident, the thing that starts the dominoes falling and the story beginning. And I thought back to that big catalogue of childhood terrors to try and find something that I remembered from my childhood that used to scare me, and there's certainly lots of them. There's spiders in this book, and there's heights and a few other things. But I remembered something that happened to me when I was about 10, walking home from school, and I found a dead cat, which had had all 4 of its paws snipped off by someone. And if I found something like that now, of course, I'd be mortified. I've got a nearly 2-year-old boy, and I'd be horrified that some sort of psychopath was roaming the neighbourhood, mutilating animals. But then I just went, oh, cool, and forgot about it by the time I got home, probably. But I didn't forget about it completely. It stuck in my head and didn't get ejected with how to calculate a volume of a cone and all these other important things that school was supposed to teach me. So it stuck in there for 30 years, and I'm glad it did, because that incident of a little boy going the wrong way home from school and finding something dead on the path became the start of the dead path. And if you'd indulge me, I'd like to read how that changed and became the actual start of the book, which happens on page 40 now. So there's quite a bit that had to go in front and quite a lot more that had to go behind. But this is where the dead path started. And so it was through tears, alone in the thudding heat, on a narrow gravel path beside Carmichael Road, that Nicholas saw the bird. It could have been anything or nothing, a tiny thing at the edge of the path, tucked mostly into the whispering grass. Black and white feathers. Was it a magpie? Nicholas leaned closer. No, it was smaller, a peewit. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, wondering what to do with it. Dead things, he knew, were dirty, riddled with germs, his mother would say, and so he considered simply kicking it completely into the grass and walking on. But as he peered closer, he saw something that made him stop, shuck off his port, and kneel. The dead bird had no feet. Its legs, no thicker than twigs, had been neatly snipped off below its backward-facing knees, revealing sections of brown black marrow ringed inside white bone as fine as porcelain, wrapped in grey, leathery skin. Nicholas closed his mouth to avoid breathing in the poachy whiff of it. Who would cut off a bird's feet? He scoured the dirt around the bird but couldn't see the severed claws. He did find a short stick, chewed in the middle by someone's dog. Delicately, aware only of the iron sun baking the back of his neck and the high electric singing of insects, he poked the stick under the dead bird and pulled the limp, swollen little body out from the grass. And then his stomach lurched. Like its feet, the bird's head had been removed. And in its place, skewered to the body with a sharpened stick, was a spherical knot of woven twigs. The bird's severed feet were stuck into the knot by the shins and protruded from it like tiny knurled antlers. Nicholas felt his fingers pulsing as his heartbeats thumped harder. Carefully, he turned the bird over. Something was painted in rust red on the false head. A vertical downstroke with an arrowhead, like a greater than symbol, on its right-hand side. Nicholas felt a swoop between his navel and his testicles. His skin was suddenly cold, and the edges of his vision were tinged with silver. He stood, heart racing, and was struck by the silence. No car passed on the road. Not a person moved behind the dark windows of the distant houses. The breeze had died, and the blade grass had lost its lizard hiss. The crickets no longer chirruped, as if even they were afraid to announce their hiding places. The sky was pale and hot as a kiln, and Nicholas suddenly felt dreadfully alive in all this stillness, brilliantly alive, with something so very dead beside him. He felt his heartbeats were loud as drums, travelling for miles. He was alive and small and terrifyingly alone, with the woods just a few feet away. He knew he had to go. Now. He kicked the bird and its strange woven head into the grass and grabbed his port. He shoved his arm into the loop, missed, shoved again, missed again. His vision was edged with glutinous dizzy stars, and finally he got his arm through the strap and straightened, just as the silence was broken. The grass crunched behind him. Deep slices through the dry grass. Heavy, deliberate footfalls, stealthy and close. The stagnant air was suddenly thickened with the odour of sweet rot, alive as the cloying whiff around the top of an old septic tank, tangy and ugly. Something was coming up behind him, something from the woods. So 3 months after I started, I had a manuscript and no idea what to do with it. So I knew enough about the film industry to know that I needed an advocate if I was going to get my manuscript somewhere. So I knew I needed an agent. So I rang a few, and invariably they said, no, our books are closed at the moment, we're not taking on new writers. Which was kind of weird. I kind of thought, well, maybe they're like Santa Claus and they know automatically who's good and who's bad. But there's more than one way to skin a cat. So and I think in this business you make your own luck to a small extent anyway. I was on a lot of emailing lists, and I got an e-flyer saying that a publicist was coming up to Brisbane. A publicist who had toured with a lot of quite famous people and novelists. And I thought, well, he's probably going to know something. It was $70 a head to go to his seminar, which was like, 2 really good bottles of wine. So, but I thought, no, I've got this 400 pages. I've got to do something with it. So I went to his talk, and I hung around afterwards, and I told him my story of woe, that I had this manuscript, a supernatural thriller, and no idea what to do with it. And he said, oh, I know an agent. She's great. She's in Sydney. She's really good. She doesn't advertise her details, so you won't be able to get in touch with her. But I will tell her what you've got, and if she's interested, she'll get in touch. And bless him, he did, and she did. And she asked for the first couple of chapters, and then she asked for the rest of the manuscript. And then she said, be patient. I had an agent, which was great. And she worked her magic. The wonderful Selwa Anthony, who I didn't realise at the time how lucky I was, but she represents some top flight authors like Tara Moss and Kate Morton and now me, which is nice. And she put the manuscript in front of Ashed Australia, who showed remarkable bravery getting behind a first-time author with a horror novel set in Brisbane. But they must have known what they were talking about, because this year it appeared on the 1st of July on Australian bookshelves, and in December will be on British bookshelves, and next year on German bookshelves. So this little story that I wrote for me, to see if I could do it, is delightfully being bought by people and read by people and enjoyed by people. And I would like to answer any questions you might have about me or the book or Stonewashed Denim. Any questions at all?
I think you should read bits like that from the start on the radio, probably the ABC. You know, sort of about 10 o'clock at night or something, because I just came across it from the
Oh, you're very kind, aren't you? Nice. But the idea is not to put people to sleep. The idea is to scare them so they can't sleep. Yeah, well, that's good. And then maybe I could dabble in sleeping pills on the side, so I can keep people awake and put them to sleep. That's very nice of you.
Back in England, this used to be called The Man in Black, and he used to read these stories, supernatural type things. They were really creepy. I used to listen to them every week.
And that's one of the bits of magic of radio, and also the magic of reading, is that, instead of having the pictures put in front of you, you use your imagination, and you can digest things more at your own pace as well. And you can project your own pictures in your head, and it makes it a much more personal thing. And that's been one of the delightful parts of this tour for me, is that people, regardless of where they are, whether it's Brisbane, where the book is set in my mind anyway, or in Adelaide or Perth or here in Tamworth, people have been saying that they really can enjoy the story and sign on for that ride that I was talking about, which is great.
Are your short stories published?
Some of them I just put in to win competitions. I kind of viewed them as calling cards, and winning short story competition certainly is, but a couple of them were published. One in the US, which was lovely, because I thought it was such a Brisbane story for me, and I actually wrote it for a Brisbane competition, which it didn't get a look into, and yet it won an American, worldwide competition. So it's great that stories that are very culturally specific can be accessed by anyone around the world if the characters are engaging enough.
So when you become more famous, they'll be collected together.
Oh, that'd be lovely. I love short story collections. I don't know how many of you do, but some people don't, but I love them. They're like, Yeah, they're like a tapas plate. You can pick and choose. If you don't like one, you can just skip to the next one, or you can take them all and you can read them out of order, and short stories are wonderful. So, yeah. Are there any writers here?
I'm doing a writing course, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about creating creative writing courses and maintaining your individuality.
I think that, like almost everything, teaching requires you to put in, and you only get out what you put in. It's really the effort of attending these things and learning the basic vocabulary of storytelling. But it'll only do so much. It can teach you how to write, but it won't make you a good writer, I don't think. I think what makes you a good writer is reading lots and lots and lots. And if you've had a lifetime of reading, you're probably perfectly qualified already to start writing. They are great insofar as they do give you the very basics, and they also give you some pointers about what to do with it after you've finished, which is great. But ultimately, the only way to become a good writer is to write a lot and to read a lot, I think. What a lovely audience. What a lovely quiet audience.
Do you have a new book?
I've got two. I've written a full manuscript for a second book, which I would prefer to be the third book. And I've started a third book, which I hope would be the second book. So, yeah. And I've had some lovely people asking me whether there will be another Nicholas Close novel. So if there is, then that would be a fourth book. So hopefully, yeah. It's early days yet, but if things go well, yeah, there'll be at least another, maybe one. Would be lovely. Yes, sir.
You share a name with an iconic Australian personality. How does that affect your relationship with people?
Well, I mean, it's tragic that Steve Irwin died. I think I have a lot of respect for him. As a fellow Queenslander, of course. I grew up not that far away from his father's and subsequently his Australia Zoo. And I remember the day that he died, I was on our property in Sanford fishing a snake out of our water tank when I heard the news. So it was kind of a strange coincidence. But given that he has passed away, it has made it a little easier and kind of spookier in a way, because people will come to this event going, yeah, I was at a spooky thing with the late Steve Irwin, and it was really ghostly. But no, he was. It would be much harder if my name was Joseph Stalin or something. That would be much worse. But that's why the M is in there as well.
Oh,
so absolutely, yeah. And I think that people that helps separate me from him. Well, thank you very much for coming out on such a lovely day and listening to me yammer on. I hope I haven't bored you. No one's given me the secret signal, so that's good. I'd like to thank very much the library for having me here today. It's a delightful library, and thank you for pulling this together. I'd like also to thank the Big Book Club, who have wonderfully sent me around the country as part of their initiative to promote literature and reading and Australian authors. And they also have the Little Big Book Club, which is close to my heart because I've got a little 2-year-old son now. And the favourite part of my day is reading to him when he wakes up and just before he goes to bed.
You don't read that,
Not yet. Early days. We'll see. Yeah. And of course I'd like to thank Ashette for getting behind this book and making it happen. And I'd like to thank you for coming and listening. So thank you very much.
For more CNRL Author Talks and other podcasts, visit our website at cnl.nsw.gov.au or follow your CNRL branch Facebook page. You can also watch many of our Author Talks. Just search YouTube for CNRL interviews. This podcast was recorded at Tamworth City Library with music by Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear, from thefreemusicarchive.org. I'm Jonathan from the CNRL Library Innovation Studio. See you next time for more CNRL Author Talks.